Okay, and so I just wanted to introduce briefly our presenter, Dr. Pedro Larrea. He is an associate professor of Spanish at the University of Lynchburg in Virginia. He is also a poet and a translator. He has participated in international poetry festivals in Honduras, in Colombia, in Chile, and also in the prestigious International Poetry Festival in Granada, Spain. He has also read at the Poetry Marathon at the Library of Congress. He also has a book of critical study of Federico Garcia Lorca. It's called Federico Garcia Lorca in Buenos Aires. Okay? And as a translator, he is very interested in translating works from English into Spanish. So he has translated Kevin Young's Book of Hours into Spanish. He is working on Ada Limon's collected poetry and also into Spanish from English. And of course, he translated Ms. Rita Dove's Sonata Mulatica from English into Spanish, and it was just recently published, I believe, in 2019. And so he is going to talk about that particular book and that particular experience of translation. And so please, let's give him a big welcome.
It's still good morning. Good morning to you all. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Professor Raquel Chiquillo and the university for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's the second time I'm visiting, and somewhat it feels like coming back home. I hope you enjoy, or at least learn something new from what I'm going to talk to you about today. My presentation is called Black and Brown, Translating Race and Culture. Like Professor Chiquillo mentioned, I am, one of my features, the sides of my job is a literary translator, professional literary translator. And it's translation that I'm going to be speaking about today, but it's going to be not your typical translating language or translating one book in one language to another kind of talk. It's also going to be, and mainly going to be, about translation as a process of translating culture through language. There is a concept I'm developing for a forthcoming book called cultural settlement. And I will be defining and developing that as we speak today. The task that I set myself to do when I choose a book to translate, and I always translate poetry, is very practical and very idealistic at the same time. I am lucky enough that my publishers in Spain let me choose a book with no regard to its potential commerciality. They do not care that much if they're going to sell or not. They just want me to choose something I consider valuable from a literary and cultural point of view. That's extremely lucky because other people are forced to translate things they don't want. So what I want to make clear from the beginning is I translate the books I choose only, the ones I love. I'm going to be talking today about poet Rita Dove's Sonata Mulatica. Here I have a copy of her original American edition, and this is the Spanish edition that came out 2 years ago. It feels like it just came out now because Ms. Dove and I have been trying to present this book both in here, in the Americas and in Europe, with no success because of the pandemic. In fact, next week, only next week, we were supposed to be in the Palace of La Alhambra in Granada, Spain, presenting her book. She was going to give a major reading there with me being just the privileged side. It's not going to be possible. She can't travel because of her health, but I'll try to honor her during this presentation. Now, when one translates, let's see if I can, when one translates a book, one translator has to consider three different perspectives. First, who am I translating? Second, to whom am I translating? That is, who is going to be my audience? Who is going to be reading this book? And are they going to be interested? Because most of the choices I'm going to make when I translate are going to be directly related and are going to depend directly on how the people I'm translating for are. What they think, what their beliefs are, what culture or cultures they belong to, what languages they speak, what variations of that language they speak. And I have to approach these issues from a very, very realistic and practical point of view, considering both virtues and prejudices of that audience. And third, I need to look at myself. The translator has to know themselves. It is equally as important because when we are speaking about our own thoughts, when we are transmitting our own ideas, well, we are entitled to them. However, when we want to channel ideas from somebody else, especially written or composed in a different language, we have a responsibility to try to convey that text, that idea, that message, without us being a roadblock for that transmission process. So first I want to share with you who am I? Who is the translator? I am not American. I'm an American by adoption now, but I am from Spain originally, from Castile. It's a region in Spain. And most of my readers are from the same part of the world. We speak the Castilian variation of Spanish. And the first thing that shocked me in this country, when I arrived, the very same day of my arrival, I learned something I had never learned about myself before. And it is that I was white. And this was fascinating to me that day because I didn't know that that category existed. Let me show you the form. Let's see if I have it here. Yes, there we go. I'm going to share with you the form or a variation, a version of the form I had to fill out for my visa and for my entrance in this country. It is called the Ethnicity and Race Identification. This is a federal official document, and it includes officially recognized American categories in America. Now, it is really simply a paper where you have to state what your race is. And I had an issue. I actually remember not knowing what to check. So I took a look and I said, okay, I'm not American Indian or Alaska Native. And you know, you have the definition on the side, so it must be easy, right? I'm like, okay, well, I'm not. No, okay. Asian, no, I'm not Asian. I'm not Black or African American. I'm not Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, that's true. White, a person having origins in any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, or North Africa. And I thought to myself, well, white in Spanish of Spain is blanco, but this category includes people from the Middle East and from North Africa. In Spain, if you say blanco, nobody thinks about somebody from the Middle East or North Africa at all. In fact, there are different categories. But in the United States, they belong to the same category. Now, I had skipped a section that I went back to again, and I'm like, oh, wait, I haven't considered this one. Are you Hispanic or Latino? I'm like, okay, let's see. I am definitely a Hispanic. I am Hispano, and I am Latino, according to the Spanish terms I knew or I was educated in. But here it says, a person of Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, South or Central American, or other Spanish culture or origin, regardless of race. And I thought to myself, okay, I am definitely Spanish culture, coming from Spain and being from Madrid, the capital of Spain. Yeah, I think I'm Spanish culture. However, when I both check yes there, and I checked white here. The officer, the immigration officer, told me that that was incorrect, that I had to fix the document. And I had no clue what he was talking about. I'm like, well, I am Hispanic and I am white. I'm Hispanic, I'm Latino, I'm white. And he said, no, you're not. Back in the day, and I'm talking about 16, 17 years ago, you could not choose both white and Hispanic. You had to choose one or the other. These days it's different. There's a little improvement there. Now you can check Hispanic or Latino regardless of the race you declare. Back then, you couldn't be both white and Hispanic, and I had an issue because I was both. He corrected it for me. He just gave me another copy, and he checked me as white, and he didn't let me check Latino or Hispanic. Then I learned what I was in this country, but I was like, I'm not this, where I come from. So when I start translating a book, I always go back to that first day, and I have to remind myself who I am and who are the readers, in this case, of Rita Dub's Sonata Mulatica, translated in Spanish and published by a Spanish European press. Who are those Spaniards? And do they consider themselves white? Am I white? Is the translator and the readers white? Let me show you. When a Spaniard identifies himself, and remember, when I refer now to a Spaniard, I'm going to be referring both to the translator and the readers of this translation. This is what we learned at home and in school until we go to college. And this is how we identify ourselves. Your standard Spanish of my generation will learn that our first identification is as a caveman. No? We're very proud of our cave paintings. I remember this in school. But certainly we do not see ourselves as white or any color in origin. We are Iberians. And from this word comes Ibero-American or Iberia. It's the Greek word for this land we call these days Spain and Portugal. Now, the Iberians are what we would call today the original or native peoples of the country we call today Spain and Portugal, the countries we call today Spain and Portugal. The Iberians mix with Celts. We're talking about 2,500 years ago. Another culture that we relate to is Celtic culture. Many people think or relate Celtic culture to or limit it to Ireland and Scotland and Wales. In fact, the Celts came from Central Europe. They immigrated from there to the West mainly, and there are still some languages in Northern Europe. However, in Spain, they developed Romance languages. So they have Galician, Asturian. Those are strong elements of identity in Spain, way stronger than color. So let's say that the foundation or the ethnicity that was the majority of Spain is the mix of Iberians and Celtics, the Celtiberians, Celtibericos, or Celtíberos. Now, Spaniards look to the south of Spain, where many of their current contemporary attractions for tourists come from, especially music like flamenco. And they look at cities like Cádiz in the picture, one of the oldest cities in Europe, founded by the Phoenicians, a Mediterranean culture. And Mediterranean is another identifier here, stronger than any color. Because Mediterranean includes different ethnicities or different colors following American jargon. So we consider ourselves Mediterranean like the Phoenicians. We definitely like to see our high culture starting with the Greeks, like most Europeans in the present, another Mediterranean culture. Carthage, many beautiful cities in southern and southeastern Spain were founded by another Mediterranean empire, Carthage. Obviously, the I say the thicker layer of culture in Spain is the identification with Rome, or the idea of Rome. I don't like saying the Roman Empire because actually Spain was part of Rome 300 years before the Roman Empire started. It became Rome during the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic lasted more than the Roman Empire, but we still refer to it as the Roman Empire. Interested there? It seems that people like empires. Then after Rome, we have a Germanic element, and that is Northern Europe. Believe me, when people tell me here that I am no Latino because I'm European, I always say, well, go ask a German guy if I am a Latino. And a German guy will tell you, yeah, he's from Spain. Yeah, he's not like one of those savages from the south. Yeah. So that element also emerged there. And finally, let's say, last huge change in demographics in Spain was the conquest of most of the country, most of the land, by North African conquerors of Muslim religion. They are wrongly called Arabs because, I say wrongly because most of them were not Arabs. Arabs are from Arabia. Most of these conquerors were from Northern Africa, so they were mainly Berber at this time in the first stages of the conquest. So Spain Spain experienced 800 years of reconquest between Christian kingdoms and Muslim kingdoms. And again, this lasted for 800 years. Then I'll stop this little history reference in 1492 when we are told in Spanish schools that modern Spain starts. So if we take a look to all these cultures, starting with the ancestral peoples, Iberians, following with the Celts, following with the resultant mix of these two layers, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Carthaginians, the Romans, the Visigoths, and finally the what we call in Spanish los Moros, the Moors. Historically, it doesn't have a bad connotation. I'm not that sure in English, but in Spanish, when we're talking about history, it's not rude, it's not unpolite. So when I see all this, and I talk to my fellow Spaniards, and I consider how we were educated and how we were made to think about ourselves, there is not a single time, not a single year in school, not a single person I've talked to that would mention the word white. In fact, all colors for what in America we call colors like black, white, or all those categories in the federal form, we see as just two general labels. You can be European, or you can be white, but there's nothing, there's very little that links somebody from Moscow, Russia, to somebody from a little town in southern Portugal. Are they both white? That's also, we could discuss about that, but they're definitely, they have very, very little in common. So my point is, the color of skin as recognized officially by the American federal government and the ethnicity idea of a Spaniard and my readers is definitely not the same. So let me show you then how I need to approach translation. I have to be aware that the work I'm translating, let's see if I have the cover here in bigger, there we go. The work I'm going to translate is going to use a language in English, American English, and is going to discuss some topics that may or may not catch the eye of my European Spanish reader. The book of Sonata Mulárica tells the story. Rizadov found a very interesting character in 18th century Europe. He was a musician, a violinist. He was a child prodigy as some sort of Mozart, more or less of a younger generation than Mozart, and he dazzled all Europe with his playing. He was the son of an African prince and a Polish mother, a Polish aristocrat mother. So he was what back in the day was referred to as mulatto. I need to say in Spanish, the word mulatto is not derogatory, and it just simply means somebody who is descends from a father and a mother of white and black ancestors. In the book, Rita chose Sonata Mulatica. That Mulatica is an imitation of the Latin language, which is a language applied a lot for classical music titles in Europe. But obviously, an American approaching this book is going to react and is going to see different things than my readers. So let me show you then what I have to think about as a translator. I had two options. Translators have many different options when we choose to channel a text to our language, to our original language, to our target language. And we have several options, but I put them into very wide groups. One, we can just use or choose to show hyperreality. What is this? This is a method of translation that was championed by Vladimir Nabokov. And he said, it is futile to try to communicate in a translated language features like rhythm or form or beauty in that sense, because there are two different languages. It's impossible, and you're only going to succeed very partially. So your mission is just to translate literally, trying to imitate the original's grammar and the original disposition and main message, if there is any. That's how he translated from the Russian to the English, Eugen Onegin. Now, there is another extreme option to translate that I considered, and that is the creative infidelity and poetic license method, championed among many by Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian writer. He's just on the other side of the spectrum, across from Vladimir Nabokov. He said, no, actually, when a translator chooses a text, he's free. Not only he's free, he should make the best out of that original to work in the target language. You're so free that you can even change the meaning, the original meaning. You can add words that were not in the original. You can, in a way, show your audience things that are interesting for them that were really not primary in the original text. In other words, the translator is another writer, kind of like mending things that don't work in the target language, and things that didn't work in the original language can be transported to the target language. So what I chose, knowing that Sonata Melodica would deal with issues that are key and central to contemporary American society and racial studies, I had to be realistic and know that my readers in Spain, they're probably not gonna, it's not that they're not interested or they wouldn't be interested, it's that they would probably miss the points. When I was a child, growing up in Spain in the 80s, in Madrid, the capital city, Madrid was probably one of the least diverse cities in the entire West. And this was as a result of a very turbulent history in the 20th century. My readers' families came from 100 years of poverty, civil wars, dictatorship, long dictatorship, and a very hard, albeit modelic transformation into a modern democracy. This happened only a couple of years before I was born. I still remember the face of my grandfather, who was almost illiterate. He was a doorman. I remember his face the first time he saw a black person in the street. And we lived in downtown Madrid, downtown capital of Spain. And his face was of surprise. He had never seen a person different than him in its visuals, only in movies, but he had never seen in real life, as he used to say. So my standard readers in Spain are not my grandfather, but they're not that far from them. They're not that far from him. So let me tell you how I concluded that my translation process would be. I have a couple of notes here. Defining translation as the process by which we translate or transfer a text from its original language to another is naive, I concluded. And furthermore, completely insufficient to understand that this operation is not only and strictly linguistic. How could it be? Translating a poem, a literary work, is trying to translate it or translating it this or that way only. You have to choose, since simply translating is absolutely impossible. We may have a very sophisticated set of tools when we engage in a translation. We can place ourselves in any place, in any position within that spectrum between Nabokov and Borges. We may recur to very sophisticated and tested methods of translation. We can be loyal to the translator, or we can be unfaithful. The Italians like to use this word play, traduttore, traditore, means translator, traitor. It's only one vowel different in Italian, saying that it doesn't matter how well you translate, you're always going to betray the author. But still, you can also commit, most importantly, treason to the reader. If you try to show the reader something that he or she is not interested, or that they don't understand, or that they don't share in a common cultural code, they will probably see a very different, probably worse picture than the original. On the left, one of my favorite paintings by Dali, and well, an American interpretation using the Simpsons. It's obviously not the same thing. Imagine translation with this anecdote. You go to a museum and you want to see Van Gogh. You love Van Gogh, but you've never seen one in real life. So you're going to go for the first time to a museum and you're going to see one of the sunflowers. So you go and you set yourself in front of this painting. You're like, wow, Van Gogh, the sunflowers. That's awesome. Now you go back home. For some reason, let's think that we live in pre-internet times, and your mother wants you to know if you had fun in the museum. And she's like, wow, Mom, I did have in the museum, I saw finally Van Gogh's sunflowers. Your mom is like, oh, okay. And can you describe them to me? Now try to describe a flower with words to your mother, who may not know Van Gogh's sunflowers. The result is probably going to be, if you're not a master writer, the result is going to be something more or less like the right. No, it's a flower, it has petals, it has a stem, it has some leaves, it's green. It's really not conveying this. That is the worst danger a translator of different cultures can incur into very easily. Now, I want to give you an example of how I proceeded with Rita Dove and with other American authors like Kevin Young. I translate Kevin Young too. He's another very prestigious African-American writer. I think he's been recently commissioned to be the director of the African-American Museum in Washington, D.C. He was recently, until recently, the poetry editor of the New Yorker. So when I approached both Kevin Young and Rita Dove, I finally found my perfect model. Perfect, there's nothing perfect, right? But close to perfect model in Johann Wolfgang von Goethe theory of translation. It is a theory from 300 years ago, so obviously I don't take it per lettera, no, but it was my inspiration. So Goethe says, was one of the first Europeans in saying, well, you know what, there's something beyond Europe in literature. No, there are other countries with other languages that are not European, and they have also masterpieces. And it's about time that we start translating them and bring them to Europe. He, for example, was a pioneer in bringing, sorry, sometimes I forget where I am, in taking non-Western classics to Europe. He was one of the pioneers in bringing Persian literature to the West, Arabic literature, Chinese literature, and he would definitely read very bad translations, but that's what it was back in the day. So Goethe came to this conclusion. He said, well, we cannot translate culture in just one cultural settlement. Remember that concept I told you about? What I mean by this, and this is not Goethe's concept, it's mine, but he was speaking about this. My generation doesn't know these countries. They don't know these languages. There may be only one or two scholars in the entire continent that know barely how to translate a text from Farsi or from Mandarin. So my generation is not gonna get a knowledge or an assimilation of that culture enough to understand their important texts. But still, we need to start translating them now. So he envisioned translation as a process of 3 steps. I see as 3 generations, 3 different cultural settlements. The first one, Goethe said, the first translation from a new culture or a not known context is the translation needs to render the foreign familiar according to our own way of thinking. For example, I always show one of my favorite examples. It's the Japanese translations of the classic Don Quixote. This is the cover of the first ever translation of the Spanish Don Quixote into Japanese. It was made in the 19th century. And if you take a look at the cover, I don't know how, can you see it right? Well, if you know Don Quixote, you'll see that he doesn't look like Don Quixote. For those of you who don't, Don Quixote is just your typical Spanish knight, but in an old version with European armor destroyed, and he's from Castile, Spain. It's definitely not that guy. So, what has the Japanese translator done here? He's taken a foreign character, Don Quixote, and has made it familiar to a Japanese audience. He's taken a famous folklore character of the Japanese lore to substitute the visual image of Don Quixote, so that the readers can more or less know, okay, it's a kind of a warrior, maybe, older, and a horse rider, and that's pretty much it. Don Quixote never uses a spear like that, by the way. And all the aesthetic is definitely Japanese. It really has nothing to do with Don Quixote. Now, this translation is necessary. Now, the next cultural settlement for Goethe would be a translation that attempts to focus on the foreign context, but its goal is not beyond an appropriation of the foreignness, a portrayal of it as our own. So in here, the next Japanese translation of Don Quixote included this illustration. We definitely see some progression in cultural understanding from the original one, from the first one. It accepts and attempts to depict foreigners. These 2 characters are definitely not looking samurai like the first one. Yes, Don Quixote, the guy on the horse, looks a little more European. He's definitely wearing some kind of Greek or Persian helmet. But look at the shield. The shield is a reproduction of an original African shield, sub-Saharan African shield. For a Japanese translator, the West was the same, like Spain and the sub-Saharan countries were the same, they were the West. That's why he could just take a Greek helmet and a sub-Saharan shield, and that made sense. It's a Western knight, so must be. Now look at Sancho Panza. Sancho Panza is wearing the Changshan typical Chinese robe. That has nothing to do with the Spanish typical image of a Spanish peasant, like Sancho was, and he's wearing those typical slippers that were simply not existent in Spain. However, we see Don Quixote is a Greek hero. We see some of the landscape that populates the book, those windmills, when Don Quixote fights windmills. So we definitely see something non-Japanese, something Western, but that idea of Western is more or less as the idea that I got from white when I had to fill out that form. It's too general for me. It's more complex than that. Then Goethe speaks about a third, let's not say perfect, let's say sophisticated, finally, translation of another culture where it attempts to be identical with the original. Those two cultures, the culture of the original book, in this case it would be Sonata Mulatica in the United States and Sonata Mulatica in Spain. These two contexts have historically come together enough that the readers of the translation are going to be able to, by their own education, by their own knowledge, understand aspects of the original that previous cultural settlements would have not. The example, to finish with Don Quixote, is one, not that recent, I think this is from the 1980s edition of Don Quixote in Japan. Now, we are actually seeing how Don Quixote, the way Spaniards see Don Quixote. He is definitely, he has a Western or a European or white features. He's wearing an existing model of Spanish Renaissance armor. It's actually the same model that King Philip II is wearing there. That one is more expensive and more decorated, but it's the same structure. So it's definitely a Spanish knight. And he's looking crazy. No, he's looking crazy. One of the main points of Don Quixote. So, obviously, what I tried to do with Sonata Mulatica is showing, is reaching this result. I am lucky because the 21st century Spain audience and American 21st century audiences are not that far in their cultural settlement. There has been a lot of cultural exchange in the last 2 centuries between the United States and Spain. So obviously, my audience is ready for this last stage. However, I want to share with you now some of the major challenges that a Spanish translator is always going to find when trying to translate culture and race from, in this case specifically, an American book. Now, sometimes you are going to find one particular issue that has to do with, well, there is a word in English, in American English, that entails or means something too strong to be common, to be used in common speech, while in the target language in Spanish is whether a word that doesn't exist, or second, it does exist, but it doesn't have a bad connotation, or it doesn't have such a worse connotation as the original English. The most conflictive ones are the first 3 examples. The first one is the contrast between the English black and the word negro in Spanish. The word negro looks dangerously in sound too, similar to the English Negro or Negro spelled in both. I've seen it in older documents in both spellings, I mean documents from the United States. But there's a difference. If we wouldn't use that word today in the United States in common parlance, we shouldn't. However, the word negro in Spanish means literally black. It doesn't have any bad connotation at all. So how am I going to translate the word Negro when Rita is talking about an 18th century African musician and the impression that he marks on European aristocracy from Germany? When she uses the word Negro, I cannot say, I need to say, and I chose Negro because we don't have another option as strong as the original. That was a hard option. Now, the N-word. Another conflict here. The same word that in Spanish we use for black is the same use for that taboo word in America. How have I translated that? There is a word in Spanish, there is an equivalent, I won't reproduce it here, even if you don't know it. It just adds 2 syllables to the original negro. And that would be a correct translation or an accurate translation of the N-word. However, that word is slang urban late 20th century Spanish. It's not 18th century English or American 20th century English. So the readers, no matter what I wrote, they're not going to get the derogatory aspect of the original word. These examples I found in the book, both in Rita and in Kevin, are similar to the ones I referred to before. As an immigrant from Europe, I found out that these words do not mean the same thing in English and Spanish either. Hispanic, Latino, or Latin American, or Hispanic American, or Spaniard, or Spanish American. So whenever I have to translate these, what do I do? As a translator, I always need to pay attention to what my customers are gonna interpret, that is my readers. What are they gonna understand? If you say Hispanic in English and in the United States, according to the federal government, it's anybody that comes from or is original from a Spanish culture or a Spanish country. That's pretty vague. Let me check where am I in time? Okay, that's pretty vague, but I'm still considered Hispanic in English and Hispano or Hispanico in Spain. The problem comes when we throw in the word Latino. I've been told by many Latinos in the United States only, not in Latin America or in Europe, I've been told here that I am not Latino. That I am not Latino because I am a Western European, so you cannot be a Latino. Latino, you have to be from South America or from Spanish America. That's been the major conflict I've had, even if I understand the cultural differences and I have to go with them. But Latino is actually literally means the inhabitants of the Lazio or the Latium, which is the region where the city of Rome has been for like almost 3,000 years. And Latino in Spanish from Spain is any individual that speaks a language that has evolved from Latin. Obviously, a Spaniard is a Latino, as a French guy is, or a Portuguese, or a Romanian, or an Italian, or a Catalan, or a Provençal, anybody that speaks a Latin language. That includes Latin speakers of all the continents, including the Americas. So for me, a Latino is, I can be a Latino, somebody from Colombia is a Latino. However, for most Latinos here that have interacted with me, I am not Latino. So if I go back to the form, to the standard form of the federal government, when I'm immigrating, what do I have to choose? The government says I am this and I am not this, but the practical usage of the word in the people that live in this country are telling me differently. As a translator, what can I choose? Well, there is no Hispanic or Latino in Sonata Mulatica, but there is a lot of the previous ones, and they were a challenge, especially when you want to transmit something that is cruel, something that is considered wrong in the original language, and in the target language is simply missed because of the lack of cultural context. Now, one lucky feature of Sonata Mulatica and why it was why it was not that hard to translate is that Rita Duff places the story of this musician in his continent, in Europe in the 18th century. Most of the context and most of the vocabulary has not to do with African Europeans. It has to do with the aristocratic environment of late 18th century Vienna, London, and Paris, where this musician lived and practiced. Now, there we go. Sorry. This is what happens when you use only one hand. There we go. So let me show you now some examples, some practical examples. Let's see. Let me know if this is too small. Let me know if this is too small. Now, let me show you a couple of examples of other type of complications. The first word I have circled here, I explained already, the word mulatto. In contemporary American English, it's a derogatory word. It's barely used. It is pretty common in Spanish with no special or derogatory connotation. I just translated it as mulatto in Spanish. However, again, the reader who is not acquainted with American culture or American history is going to miss the original usage of mulatto, that Italian word in English. Now, there's another kind of complication. An American audience may be more or less acquainted with some of the history of England or Britain because of the historical ties, because of the United States being originated in British colonies. So when Rita speaks casually about a character, for example, here she's talking about Mad King George, and it's that George, and his spendthrift son Prinny. How am I going to translate these culturally to Spaniards? Spaniards have no idea who King George was, and they have no idea who Prinny is. Many Americans may know this King George because, well, he was the King George that fought against independence. So this familiarity doesn't exist. Now, Rita makes also a point in showing or in mentioning characters that are very familiar to Americans. Thomas Jefferson, for example, or Sally Hemings. There is a poem in the book where the George Bridgetower, the African-European violinist, is playing in Paris, and everybody is being impressed. And in the audience, there is Thomas Jefferson. He was at the time the American ambassador in Paris. The translator has two options here. First, let it go and trust that there are some Spanish readers that know who Thomas Jefferson is. Believe me, Thomas Jefferson is a vague figure, kind of founding person in the United States, but that's it. Nobody knows who Sally Hemings is. These days, you can look it up on Google, but traditionally, I do not count on that. So I have another option. I can use a translator note. I'm sorry for the expression, I hate those. I hate those because they're not in the original, obviously, and I think that unless it is a totally unknown culture or a totally far away cultural settlement from that of my audience, I don't think they're necessary. They just trample the reading. So that's why my book doesn't have any footnotes, any translator notes. I prefer to write a small, very brief prologue where I clarify what are going to be the challenges of that cultural understanding. Well, let me show you. There we go. Again, the word mulatto is there. Now, when talking about semantics, that is, when a poet, in this case Rita, chooses a specific semantic field to develop in a poem, that is way harder to translate than a single word. Let's take a look to this poem. It's the second or third poem of the book. It says, prologue of the rambling sort, "This is a tale of light and shadow, what we hear and the silence that follows. Remember these as we set out across sea and high roads, as talk turns to gentlemen and valets, grave robbers and tormented souls. This is a story about music and what it does to those who make it, whom it enslaves. Yes, slavery of all kinds enters into the mix. Although the skin of our protagonist does not play so great a role in his advancement and subsequent fade from grace as might be imagined, or does it? Rather, let us say that the racial divide has not yet been invented. You lived, you died, things happened between the two." I'll stop there. Now, with other example here, just an isolated one, bright-skinned Papa's boy. All this semantic field is barely translatable for a Spanish audience because the vocab related and the expressions related to that opposition between light and shadow are mostly interpreted as a philosophical fight between good and evil, mostly. That's one of the most common examples, but it is very hard that without a proper introduction or a translator note or a common reading, Spanish standard reader is going to relate all these semantic field to the history of the United States, to dimensions to slavery, excuse me, huh? Putting together the metaphor of George Bridge Tower being an African European rejected, that in parallel in the 18th century also with the high peak of the establishment of slavery. A Spanish audience is really not going to catch that. Here we go. I want to show you an example here of something I explained before. This is a quote from, it's a real quote from a French newspaper that Rita takes as an introduction to the the second section of the collection. And it's like a review of a concert that George Bridge Tower gave. Un de vos curieux, qui a infiniment intérêt, c'est celui de Bridge Tower, jeune nègre des colonies. The English translation, a curious depth and one of infinite interest is that of Mr. Bridge Tower, young Negro from the colonies. How have I translated this? I have the only option was using the word negro. But again, it just means black. It doesn't imply inferiority like here. The word Negro back then, and especially in the French, nègre des colonies, that was pretty strong. It was, even if it's a laudatory comment, even if it's a praising review, the author wanted to establish that, you know, it's even better because look, the guy who's done it is somebody who is not like up here, no? So he has more merit, he's more spectacular. And that word, that implication is clear in the French, definitely in the French. It's clear by the choice of that word in English. It's not clear at all in Spanish. It is very easy to miss. I have another example here. I love this poem. It's called Renaissance. Snow's a gentle pillager. It sucks where we have no more rags to bind, seeks out our farthest tips to freeze in reprimand. From the east, an icy flourish reminds us how meager an essence we harbor. Mere blood and burbling humors thrust into a package of skin. Then, each booted stride a cracking, trudge, slip, or woeful processional. This is our lot, our stage creation. Whiteness billowing, fussed silence sliced by a woman, one scream only, quickly held back. She is one of us, a peasant mindful of the body's purpose. Be strong, survive. Now, the scene that Rita is describing is a Polish village in the 18th century, a poor village of peasants in Poland in winter. That's what the context is. That's what the Spanish reader is going to get. However, if we are in an American context, educated readers can see the Renaissance title as obviously in relation to an African-American literary movement, artistic movement from the early 20th century. That reference is going to be lost. So, how did I translate this? Renaissance is the French word for the Spanish renacimiento. What I did in this one is not translate it. I just left the original Renaissance. Because a Spaniard knows that if I write renacimiento in Spanish, that's going to be, it's not going to be caught, it's not going to be perceived. However, if I leave the original French Renaissance that we use in English, then the reader is going to notice something weird going on. And the alertness is going to be different. It's going to be more pronounced. Now, the semantics here, the vocab chosen, snow's a gentle pillager, a package of skin, whiteness billowing. The Spanish reader is just going to see that Polish village just drenched in snow. But from an American, and I've discussed this with Rita, and it's very, very fascinating to listen to her speak about this. Obviously, when she's talking about snow and skin and whiteness billowing and the white being a gentle pillager, we're talking about something that we're going to definitely get here. These are some of the challenges. I think I have time to show you another. Yeah. Now, there we go. Now, there are a couple of poems in the book where Rita gives the word to a specific European aristocrat that is hosting musicians or artists of any kind. And she writes some monologues of these for these aristocrats. Now, one of my favorite is called Capriccio. Miklos the Magnificent, otherwise known as Nicolaus Joseph of the clan Salomon in the Chalkos, my Hungarian is not only horrible, it's just not existent, and successor to the seat of Esterhazy in Galanta, royal instigator of the Baroque castle at Fertod, lieutenant field marshal of the Austrian Empire, decorated, musician, practiced, sober, honest, and educated by Jesuits, had a fantasy to assemble an array of nature's eccentricities, a dwarf, an African, perhaps a gypsy, or ferocious Turk or flat-faced Borneo. Now, in this case, interestingly enough, a process quite the opposite happened when I translated this into Spanish. Now, the word gypsy, that's another difference I've noticed. In the American English, a gypsy, or what most people I've spoken with, anyways, understand by a gypsy, is these archetypical, stereotypical character that is a daredevil or a traveler or somebody who is into New Age, I don't know. But the word gitano in Spanish gypsy is more real because gitanos are the first minority in Spain. And they have been for centuries, and they are an integral part of some of the most Spanish manifestations of art, especially in music. So when Rita is saying gypsy, she's not saying gitano. And in this case, a gypsy is not an eccentricity for a Spanish reader. So how did I translate that? I didn't say gitano. I used cíngaro, like cingar. It is a word that, although it's not very used in Spanish, the Spanish reader can understand and can see as something exotic. It's the word they use for gypsies in Italy and in Eastern Europe. So by not translating that as gitano, they can see I'm not referring to a cultural to an ethnicity that we're familiar with. It's something that Miklos is seeing as an animal, a foreign, an alien, an attraction, no? Like a zoo attraction. Now, let's see. Let me show you the last one. Another major difficulty that we find, rhyme. How do you translate rhyme? Let's take a look to this one. Lines whispered to a pillow, staff quarters, Esterhazy estate. Little monkey, little cow, can you hear me listening now? Ticking clock, piano plink, watch me hear you, feel me think. Impossible. I tried like probably 20, 30 times. The rhyme is not only a challenge, but most of the times it is a limitation to the translation of meaning, to the conveyance of culture. You have to make choices that first were not in the original, second, are diluting or blurring the cultural meaning or the cultural load. I think I have another one. Yes, this one is the main one. I wanted to finish with this example. When George Bridge Tower was presented in court, he was presented as the Moor Friedrich Augustus, that's his father, the Moor Friedrich Augustus. And then George Bridge Tower is also going to be referred as to the Moor. Now, in English, if any standard educated American or British individual hears Moor and is asked to think about a character in literature, who are you going to think about? Othello, the Moor. Now, there's a problem here. The Moor is the term to translate the Spanish Moros, who were those North Africans that conquered Spain and Portugal back in the 8th century and stayed there for 8 centuries. Now, Othello is a Moor? I don't know. I can tell you that George Bridge-Sauer was not a Moro. He was an African, a black, but when a Spanish reader reads more, he's going to be confused because he's going to be like, wait a second, wasn't he African? How can he be an African or a black African and a Moor? Because Moor refers to the Berber and the Moroccans, northern peoples of Africa, that according to the federal American government are considered white, like the Europeans and then the Middle Easterns. So Spanish reader is going to think about basically a Muslim Northern African that is not black, may be darker in skin, or as in America they say brown, but it's definitely not going to imagine what the musician was, what George Bridge-Sauer was. So I have not translated this as Moro, but just I use the word black or African, depending on the case, depending on the exigencies of rhyme and meter. But definitely not Moro. So the lesson one learns when translating culture is that there are things that are simply not translatable, that we need to put some burden faith in the reader to bridge this understanding, or to focus on aspects of the original book that do make sense or an easier sense in the target language. I think I have 20 seconds. Let's see if I have. I think I have. There we go. Now, culturally, this didn't work. The original doesn't work very well in Spanish either. The wardrobe lesson. George Bridge-Sauer was given very colorful clothes and very exotic clothes because the aristocrats thought that he being black, he would like colors. I don't really get this, but, and I'll finish with this. But it says, everyone in this bright South village believes an African loves color. So let it be. And then he proceeds to describe all the different clothing items that he's forced to wear with many different colors. Now, a Spanish reader, if I translate this like that, a Spanish reader is going to say, an African loves color? We love colors too. Yeah, and actually, Spaniards are infamous when they go to do tourism in Northern Europe. As I mentioned before, Germans, British, Scandinavians consider Spaniards as savages or less civilized, and therefore they always wear very, very screaming colors, as they say. So a Spanish is not going to see anything exotic about about this option of the aristocracy wanted alien people to dress in colors. It's like, isn't that the natural thing to do? That's what we do, right? So again, there is a very subtle, there's a very subtle relation between the culture you're translating and the language that is conveying it, and you have to translate always with the assurance that you will not be able to literally translate, but you can culturally translate. That's what I've done with, or tried to do, with Rita Dove and with Kevin Young. Right now, I'm translating Harjo's memoir, Joy Harjo's memoir, the current American Poet Laureate, Native American to Spanish, and that is another challenge. It's the first book by a Native American that I'm translating into Spanish for a Spanish from Spain audience. But that's another story, and I'll tell you probably in a couple of years how it goes. Thank you very much. And I think we have 15 minutes for questions or comments or anything that the audience wants to comment. 5, you said 5? I overspoke? Oh, man. Oh, it's because we waited another extra 5 minutes. That's why my clock, and I didn't adjust in my clock. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes. I can hear you perfect.
So here in the U.S., there is like a drive to use the word Latinx for Latino. And Latinx is not an existing word in Spain. Is that correct?
It is correct. The X doesn't have the same use. There in the one we use it here, Latinx, X is meaning you can write an A or an O, or whatever, indicating no matter the gender identity, it's included in the term Latin. So no, that letter simply doesn't work that way in the Spanish language. So no, we wouldn't have that term. Latino, Latina. There's a whole discussion about gender in Spanish these days. What linguists mainly insist is that what they call gender, what we call gender, like female, male, or has nothing to do with linguistic gender, and they say that O doesn't necessarily mean masculine and A feminine. It is simply how the language evolved from Latin. Now, I'm no expert in the evolution of Latin to Vulgar Latin and from there to the Romance languages, but I studied something in college, and I remember that it is true that some words have evolved one way or another, and they never implied gender mentality. Like speakers don't say, okay, I'm going to use this word in the masculine or the feminine. It happens because of the constrictions of the time and space, the cultural element of the time, obviously, and then that's how it evolves. But obviously, standard citizens don't think about linguistics at all. No. Yeah. Yes.
You had mentioned in passing a couple of times speaking with Rita Dove.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering how important is access to the author to your process, or is it something that is nice but not necessary? How important is that?
I love that question because I have a story with that. I met Rita Dove way later than I met her work. When I arrived as a graduate student to the University of Virginia, she was already a creative writing professor there. I started reading her, but I didn't want to meet her because when I find a new author that I love, that I just all of a sudden read her works and I'm like, oh wow, I love it, I am very, very hesitant to know the person. Because in most cases, this has only happened to me with poets, not with other professions, but with poets, mainly the individual is disappointing in comparison to their works. Yeah, that's another conversation though. But that's why I didn't have any prejudice against anybody. But I was like, no, I prefer just to keep it to myself. Then I had the privilege to meet her and to read with her, and we've been knowing each other for a couple of years now, been together in poetry festivals, and she is one of the exceptions to that, to that idea that I had about poets. She is awesome. She is super accessible, and she was insisting all the time, Pedro, you don't bother me. Like, you don't have to go through my secretary. You don't have to go through anything. Just email me here. Let me know or call me. Let me know if you need something with this word here, with this poem there. I know this other poem is very complicated, blah, blah. I never ask her for advice because I never found any confusing poem or line or word that I didn't know what it meant. I've been in the U.S. for almost 17 years, and I've been studying American culture since I was in school. So I think I was qualified, and also I think that the author may somewhat interfere because Rita doesn't speak Spanish. She is an excellent speaker of German. Her husband is German, and she studied in Germany. She studied abroad as a young student in Germany, but she doesn't know any Romance language either, so she doesn't have a reference point where she could be of linguistic help in that sense. So I prefer not to, unless it is extremely necessary. I translate from other languages too, and that I command better or worse than English, and in sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes I have checked with the author. Anything else? I think we have time for another one question. Anything else? Yes. In Spanish, in Spain? I always say Spanish in Spain because Spain being such a spread language, having so many dialects and so many lexicon in different countries and regions, I always specify that's what I mean. Mulatto is just simply a person whose one parent is black and the other is white. That's it. And it doesn't have any bad connotation. just the word.
One last question. Yes. You mentioned you're working on translating works from a Native American author.
Joy Harjo. Mhm.
Do you mind just expounding on some of the challenges you have faced so far?
Yes, the challenges with Joy are not being linguistic, they're being cultural. And that's one of the main reasons I chose to translate her in this work. It's not a poetry collection, it's a memoir. It's the first memoir. She recently published the continuation to that memoir, but this is the first one. Starting with the title, Crazy Brave. If I just translate Crazy Brave like, loca and valiente, we're missing the English, the American English meaning of brave, which is a Native American warrior. That's how it's used, not only brave to say courageous. So starting with the title, that was a challenge, and I thought it was going to be loaded with them. No, linguistically, it's pretty accessible, but the culture. She speaks about her family, her traditions, her culture, and her rituals, her daily lives, and they are things that not even like non-Native Americans know in this country. Not many people know or study the native cultures of this country. Think about Spaniard. So the hard part here is not translating linguistically, it is just trying to actually convey what she means by what she's telling. When she says that she's having a dream, for example, and she sees some animal. In Spain, we may have that dream, we may dream with that animal, but that animal may mean something different or may mean nothing at all. So it is more the cultural settlement that I'm trying to bridge there than linguistic. There is no knowledge at all, and I'm generalizing, but again, I always take the standard Spaniard of my generation that has at least gone to school and high school and college. We don't know anything about Native American cultures. To my surprise, not many Americans do either. So I'm trying to, and in this case, I don't know Joy Harjo personally. I know, I had the chance to meet her, but I want to meet her after the book is done. She doesn't speak Spanish either, so she wouldn't be of any help there. But yeah, it's the culture. I'd say, wow, how do I say this in a way that this ritual, this dream, this type of meeting, or when she's speaking about historical events that most Americans know, like Wounded Knee, for example. When she speaks about Wounded Knee, she speaks like very casually about it in the sense that she takes for granted that her American readers know, or are going to know, at least educated ones are going to know what that was. I need to make a footnote there, or an endnote. I don't like footnotes. An endnote, translator note, explaining what Wounded Knee was. When she refers to a specific battle or a specific episode between the confrontation of the U.S. government and the native peoples, I have to put that in context too, but that has to be through notes. I don't have a problem with Joy Harjo writing notes in this book because it's a memoir. It's not like a poetry collection where a footnote is really horrible. It really interrupts the lyricism or the music. In here, I afford some translator notes, and that's one of them. That's the case where I need them the most. Mm-hmm. Oh.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. Rest assured, we all really appreciate it. And if you registered and you would like lunch, it's about lunch is just outside. Pick this up. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I want to finish with just one note. It is very hard to speak about a process that is so little settled. That it's when you translate, it's so unexpected. Every single line. And speaking about it, it's also very hard. So thank you very much for your patience here.